What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 competitive budget decks for the February 2021 format. You don't need playsets of Forbidden Droplet or Triple Tactics talent to be able to compete in the competitive TCG format. There are plenty of options available, and today we're going to be covering my top 5 favorites that you could be taking into any sort of event, whether it's a small little tournament online or something as big as a Yu-Gi-Oh! Extravaganza, and that way you can see a good amount of success. Now, to preface this video like I typically do, budget is a relatively subjective term. So for the purposes of this video, my definition of a budget deck is anywhere for the main and extra deck between $100 to $150 US. That may sound like a lot, but when you consider some of the best decks of the format can be almost 3, if not 4 times that amount, you are getting a lot of bang for your buck. Additionally, if you plan on buying any cards as a result of watching this video, be sure to use my affiliate links down in the description because some of them even give you 5% off, and who doesn't want to buy shiny cardboard for cheap? So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So kicking things off at number 5, I've got Prank Kids. Now, Prank Kids actually put out a lot of power for the price that you are able to afford these cards at. Since this deck came from a deck building set, most of the cards are very inexpensive since they've been mass printed. The only exception to that is a couple of the cards. The first of which is the field spell Prank Kids Place. It was a secret rare, and so since it still has yet to have a reprint, this is sitting at about $15 to $20 a copy. And since Prank Kids has been a little bit on a rise, both because of the pure variant as well as the Adamantipator variant, which is a little bit out of our budget, we've seen cards such as Doodle Doo also go up in price as well to about the $9 to $10 price range, but everything else in the deck is maybe only a couple of cents per copy of the card, and since the deck is predominantly like 25 to 30 cards worth of Prank Kids, then you're not going to be spending that much. The power of Prank Kids rests in the fact that all of the Prank Kids are now one-card starters thanks due in part to the new Prank Kids Link monster that was released, I believe, in Phantom Rage not too long ago. This really gave the deck a boost and made it that you were able to combo off so heavily, so easily, and that is all thanks to that Link monster. The Link monster also serves a dual purpose because it allows you to use it to banish, to be able to enable you to do some absurdly ridiculous combos, like being able to go into Battle Butler and Regeki your opponent's board twice. You have the ability to go up against some of these spell and trap decks with stuff like Roar and Rooster. There's so many good reasons to play a deck like this, and for any combo players out there, this is definitely going to be the deck for you. A nice feature about Prank Kids as well is that a majority of the cards in the extra deck are also Prank Kids focused cards, so you don't need to be spending a lot of money on these specific generic cards, although that could be a nice upgrade path for you if you want to buy something like, let's say, an Access Code Talker, but it isn't necessary right out of the gate. Something like Borosaur Dragon would suffice just fine, and that is the much cheaper budget option, but most of the extra deck is comprised of Prank Kids monsters, which means you're not going to be spending most of your money on the extra deck like some decks typically require. While Prank Kids is a bit of a glass cannon because it does lose pretty hard to a card like Nibiru, which moves in and out of the format depending on how it shifts, Prank Kids has still been a very solid rogue option for the better part of the last several months, and it's going to continue to do so because the deck is super cheap, it's super accessible, it's also a lot of fun to be able to do some of the crazy stuff that this deck can do, and so for those reasons, that's why I've got Prank Kids at number 5. But coming in at number 4, we've got Dinosaur. Yes, Dinosaur is one of the budget deck kings, and of course it had to make its way onto this list. Now, Dinosaur definitely has taken a step or two down compared to its previous status as being, you know, a solid tier 2 option, and honestly, it was a tier 1 option not too long ago, but it's still an incredibly accessible deck. Thanks to the fact that most of the cards from this deck did come from a structure deck, it's super easy to acquire them, and that's also managed to keep the prices of some of these cards down. In addition to that, cards like Pot of Extravagance have been reprinted multiple times now, and this was a staple in the deck for several years, and now because it's been reprinted, that's easy to acquire. I'd say the biggest expense you're going to have to spend on a Dinosaur deck is a copy of Animadorned Archosaur, and you're going to have to spring a little bit more if you want to get 2. However, you can get away with 1 just fine. Dinosaur is the aggressive deck on the list and does some of the most unfair things imaginable. Remember, when you're playing a budget deck, you want to find any advantage you can that you can have over your opponent to do some unfair things, because when you are on a budget, you need to be able to figure out what you can do that's equally as unfair as what your opponent will be doing playing a tier 1 strategy. With a card like Miscellaneousaurus that is able to insulate your entire board from any sort of interaction whatsoever, that's the type of unfair dynamic you want your deck to have. Not to mention you have a card like Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, which is just an absolute house and can completely hose a lot of these slower decks if you are able to capitalize on the fact that Dinosaur is as aggressive as it is. Dinosaur has also managed to evade the ban list for quite some time, and with the way that Dinosaur is faring in the current current environment, I don't expect this deck to be hit on the upcoming ban list that we should be receiving in a few weeks from the time of recording. And that's something you also want to keep in mind if you plan on purchasing any cards during this time, is you want to think about how future-proof the deck might be, because if you spend $100 to $150, that may be a lot of money to you, so you want to protect your investment as best you can. So you want to think about the decks that maybe aren't performing at the top tiers, so then that way, once the ban list does come, your deck will be untouched, and you'll be able to enjoy that deck for the next format, which will be anywhere from 2 to 3 months. But overall, the deck's just fantastic, right? It's got tons of consistency. Oviraptor and Fossil Dig, again, I don't know how these cards aren't hit either. This deck has so many tools at 3. It's great going first, but it's an amazing deck going second. You can really do a lot to kind of pivot it to your liking. There's also variations that can go into True King of All Calamities if you really want to go down that route, but in any case, it's one of the budget kings. You can expect it to be on the list, and that's why we've got it coming in at number 4. Now, coming in at number 3, we're going to slow down a little bit to the more control side of the game, but this is where a lot of the budget decks can truly thrive. Another deck that came from a structure deck, we're talking about Shaddoll. Now, some of you might be thinking, there's no way I can afford Shaddoll on a budget, because when you look at decks like Dogmatica Shaddoll or Invoke Shaddoll, some of the cores that you mix with the Shaddoll package are just way out of budget. And while that may be true, that doesn't mean you still can't play Shaddoll in more of a pure form with a ton of trap cards. If there's anyone who's been perfecting this way of playing Shaddoll, it is definitely Pack, and you'll definitely want to check out his channel. But I think Trap Shaddoll is a very strong and very viable rogue budget contender. The reason for this is because, again, we want to do as many unfair things as possible, and one of those is having access to El Shaddoll window. When we have a format where a lot of special summonings going on, even in a much slower format, Winda can still be one of our saving graces. Shaddoll also has access to a card like Ariel, which is great because it's essentially like a DD Crow on steroids, and in a graveyard-reliant format, this card can actually do wonders in being able to hose our opponent's graveyard to stop them from being able to play the game. Back that up with an arsenal of incredibly powerful trap cards, and you are going to be in control. Torrential Tribute's amazing in this deck because all of the Shaddolls have some sort of effect that triggers when they're in the graveyard, so you actually generate advantage off of not only torrentialing your opponent's board, but even your own in some instances as well. You also have stuff like the Solemn package to be able to ensure that your opponent isn't going to stick any of those monsters that get summoned from the extra deck. Hell, you can even go with Solemn Judgment just to say no to absolutely everything. You can even still play stuff like Dogmatica Punishment because you don't need stuff like the Dogmatica package to play a card like this. Paleozoic Dinomitius is also another backup card you can play. There's actually a wide variety of very budget option friendly trap cards that you can play in a deck like this and see a very high degree of success in the current competitive format because it isn't spiraling out of control. The deck can also be super aggressive as well when you have cards like El Shaddoll Construct to turn up the gas when you have to and really go in for all that damage. And with El Shaddoll Fusion, you can win games out of nowhere that you may not have won otherwise. And so when you consider the fact that, again, most of the cards in the Shaddoll deck were actually reprinted in the Shaddoll structure deck, and for any card that wasn't, it comes at like common or super rare rarity, which means you can pick it up for maybe under $1 or $2 each, then you have the makings of one of the strongest rogue contenders of the current format. You really can't go wrong with this one, and that's why I've got Shaddoll coming in at number 3. But coming in at number 2, we actually have a deck that has never made its way onto this list before because it's actually a relatively new deck from the past month or so, and that deck is Lyrilusk TriBrigade. Yes, Lyrilusk TriBrigade is here to stay, ladies and gentlemen. This first originated out of the OCG, then a lot of TCG players started to take it up and make their own adaptation, and this deck is incredible. You're talking about one of the best budget options, maybe the best budget option, but obviously it's not number 1, but we'll get to that a little bit later on. For those of you who have never seen Lyrilusk TriBrigade before, I'm probably going to be featuring it in Deck of the Week later on this week, so you can stick around for that. But what this deck is able to do is it is able to ultimately end on turn 1 on a Cimoooooooo Bird of Sovereignty, which can then special summon a barrier statue of the Stormwinds, and what that basically means is that your opponent can't play the game. And when you look at the best decks of the format, you'll realize that some of them are very special summoning reliant. They have no out to this, and they will pretty much scoop on the spot. Most of the Lyrilusk cards in this deck are like common or rare, maybe super rare at the highest. And then when you have the TriBrigade cards, I think the most expensive card you're gonna have to shell out for is Fractal, but even then, Fractal was an ultra rare, and it's anywhere from about $10 to $15 a copy, depending on where you're able to pick it up. And so aside from Fractal and maybe 1 or 2 of the extra deck monsters, which might be an ultra or secret rare, most of the cards in this deck are low rarity. And so when you combine the two together, you have one of the strongest hybrid decks for competitive play that can be played on a budget. The most expensive card you're probably going to need in a Lyrilusk TriBrigade deck is Zeus, and you only need a single copy of it because you have the ability to go into the Lyrilusk that can attack your opponent directly. So similar to like Zodiac Borbo, you now have a way to be able to access Zeus, and being able to access Zeus in a budget deck is absurd. But again, being able to go into the plays to stop your opponent turn 1, you have Zeus if you're going second, but even so, the TriBrigade engine itself is so powerful, being able to help break boards because you have cards like the Link 4 that can just start banishing your opponent's threats. That's also super good considering Eldritch is one of the tier 1 decks of the format, and that way it's not going to be able to recur all of its resources and have that level of inevitability that makes the deck so strong. Now, more and more people are starting to realize the potential that Lyrilusk TriBrigade has, and as a result of the release of Blazing Vortex, we have the brand new TriBrigade kit, which also gives the deck some more consistency, so people are actually flocking to this deck to try it out, and it's a pretty sweet deck. This deck can do a lot of super cool things. It's really fun. It can do a lot of its plays before it even commits to a normal summon a lot of the time, so that just seems broken, right? And again, I want to reiterate, one of the biggest things you're looking for when you're playing a budget deck is how many unfair things that deck can do. So when you're telling me you can lock your opponent out of special summoning and also be able to play Zeus, that sounds pretty good to me. So that's why I've got Lyrilusk TriBrigade at number 2. So that's going to bring us to my number 1 competitive budget deck of the February 2021 format. And if you haven't already figured it out, I don't know where you've been the last several months, but that deck is Virtual World. Yes, Virtual World, a competitive budget deck. Yes, that may shock a lot of you, but this deck is actually incredibly affordable to the average player. When you take a look at the deck, and I'm actually going to show you the second place Yu-Gi-Oh! Extravaganza list from Herman Hansen, this main and extra deck is affordable by so many players because most of the Virtual World cards came at super rare rarity, which means there's plenty of them in circulation. The only exception to that is maybe Lulu, and Lulu is like one of the main searchers of the deck that you need 3 of, but Lulu's still sitting at about 15 to 20 bucks a copy, and that's really the only expensive card you have to shell out for, aside from a copy of Zeus. Now, other than that, the deck just plays cards like Desires, which has numerous reprints, and then you just play some staples and some hand traps, and just like that, you not only have a strong competitive budget contender, but you possibly have the strongest deck of the format, period. And why is that? Well, obviously it's because of True King of all Calamities. Thank God they printed Calamities as a super. Imagine if Calamities was a secret rare in like a core set. This would have been like a $70 to $80 card at this point. So I'm very thankful that that is the case, but you should be taking advantage of that. Now, I will say that again, we do have a ban list coming up very soon, and if there is a deck to get hit, Virtual World could definitely be it, because this deck has been at the top of competitive play for about 4 to 5 months now, maybe even a little bit longer than that. And so Konami might feel like, yeah, we need to put this deck in check. So this deck may have a target on its back, and that's something you need to consider. But if you're looking for the best competitive budget deck of the format to play, it is without a doubt Virtual World, and it is not even close. The fact that you can basically build the deck without having to make any sort of substitutions or alterations and play the strongest deck of the format, how could you ask for anything else? That is incredible. Now, there's several reasons for this, right? I mean, again, we talked about how most of the cards came as the core set, but also the fact that the extra deck monsters specifically are also low rarity, but they're also not like generic options that you'll see in every single deck. This deck actually takes advantage of some very specific Synchros and Xyz monsters that have had multiple printings by this point, and they're super easy to acquire for the most part, and so you're not having to break the bank to pick up stuff like Axis Code Talker and the like, because you don't have to, and that's what makes this deck even more affordable. And honestly, I don't know if it was by design, but I really hope Konami takes note of this and decides to make more archetypes like this in the future that are not only some of the strongest decks of the format, but they're also very accessible by the masses. Because depending on what point in time you were looking to play this deck, some people were playing stuff like 3 copies of Triple Tactics Talent, maybe stuff like 3 copies of Forbidden Droplet, and that's perfectly fine, but those generic powerhouse spells were the only reason that this deck was out of range for most players. The core deck itself was never the case. And so when you have a deck that is super consistent at pumping out their main boss monster like True King of all Calamities, you can pivot into stuff like Shen Shen to be able to have this floating macrocosmos on their field that's always going to come back. I mean, the deck is just absurd. It continues to win event after event, and it's probably going to do so until something gets hit in the deck. The deck is just phenomenal. It's fantastic. There's no other way to put it. It has continued to prove that it is one of, if not the best deck of the past several months. And honestly, if anyone's making a list for competitive budget decks, this has to be your number one. There's a chasm between this deck and the other 4 on this list because it's just so good. You don't have to make any concessions. And even if you invested in this and something did get hit on the ban list, you're not going to be out that much money because it is a competitive budget deck, and that is amazing. And the best part is, let's say Virtual World dodges the list again, maybe Konami wants to keep it around for a little bit longer, then you are going to have probably the best deck for the next several months. So again, be sure to use my affiliate links down in the description if you plan on purchasing anything as a result of watching this video. Some of those links even give you 5% off, so that way you can buy this budget deck for even cheaper, and who doesn't want to buy cheaper cardboard? So guys, that's going to wrap it up for the video. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video informative, consider supporting me on Patreon for exclusive early one-day access to both the history of Yu-Gi-Oh and the Yu-Gi-Oh progression series. Thank you all so much for watching, and we will see you next time.